I'm Lucy Beadnell with the ARC of Northern Virginia, and this is my session to share a little bit about using your Virginia Medicaid waiver to pay for caregivers. Yes, Katerina, I'm sorry. I saw that I was still muted. I stopped talking because I hadn't touched my computer or the mouse button, so I thought someone had muted me. But if I'm good to keep going, then I will do that. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to share a little bit about who the ARC of Northern Virginia is so that you understand a little bit of where we're coming from, and then I'll talk through using Medicaid waiver options. I will note that the Medicaid waiver that I know best is Virginia-based, but all states have some version of the Medicaid waiver. So if you're either not currently a Virginia resident or you may be moving in and out of Virginia, no, all states have some version of this program. It's all a Medicaid waiver. It may be called different specific titles and things like that, but we'll go ahead and jump right in here. Okay. So as I said, first I'll talk a little bit about who the ARC of Northern Virginia is and the types of waivers that we have in Virginia. What are they? What kind of services do they provide? And how would you apply? And then we'll pull that back to how you could use a waiver to fund a caregiver with Apex Social. And my contact information will be at the end. The ARC of Northern Virginia is one of a nationwide network of ARC chapters. We're all separate 501c3 organizations, but we do share the same mission, which is to promote and protect the human rights of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and ensure they're fully included and supported in their community. And we all do that in different ways. A lot of what our chapter does is advocacy, trying to change laws, policies, regulations.
Lucy, I'm so sorry to come on stage, but I think you're muted.
Thank you. No, thanks for doing it. I'm not sure why it keeps muting, and when I share my slides, I can't see any of the functionality in Hopin.
No worries. I'll stay right here in the session. I'm going to mute myself and go off screen, and I will let you know in case it happens again.
Okay. Thanks so much. Because I can't see the chats or anything when I'm sharing this. Okay. Okay. So in Virginia, we have two kinds of waivers. One called the DD waiver for people with developmental disabilities. There are actually kind of subsets of this waiver, but it really offers a big menu of services for home and nursing and work and community, staff up to 24 hours a day, case managers, really robust supports in some ways, but there's a long waiting list for them. We also talk a lot in Virginia about the CCC plus waiver that requires some kind of disability diagnosis. So that certainly could be a developmental disability and a medical need. So that would be things like, does the person have an uncontrolled seizure disorder? Does the person need G-tube feedings? Does the person need really significant therapeutic interventions like OT, speech, those kinds of things? It's got a much shorter menu of services, no employment or residential options. 56 hours of care a week is the cap. There's no case management, but there's no waiting list. So at any given time, when we're talking about our DD waivers, there's in Virginia right now about 14,000 people waiting for them. About a quarter to a third of those folks, instead of waiting with nothing, are able to use that CCC plus waiver right away because they not only have a developmental disability diagnosis, they've got a medical need too. So they can wait for one and use the other. Okay. So to take a little bit of a deeper look into the kinds of services that are offered, DD waivers are the program that will ultimately offer 24/7 staffing. So if we're looking way ahead and we know someone's eventually going to need a 24/7 residential situation, their apartment with support or a townhome with a live-in aid or old style group home or whatever that looks like, the DD waivers fund significant amounts of employment supports if the person with a disability is trying to work full-time or part-time, volunteer, gain new skills, those kinds of things. There's respite money for families in addition to weekly care hours that you'll get with the DD waiver. I'll make up a number. Let's say based upon your needs and schedule, you've been allotted 20 hours a week. You also get 480 hours of respite for the whole year. And you can sort of allot those as you need. So for some people during times like spring break or summer break, parents need more care hours. That's a great time to pull from those respite hours. And the DD waiver can offer a lot of nursing supports. It can give up to $5,000 a year to change the home or car of the person with a disability or the car that's used to drive them. So that can be things like widening doorways, putting in ramps, safety barriers, those kinds of things. And also up to $5,000 a year for portable technology that would help the person with a disability. So iPads and communication software are really common requests, but it certainly could be other things. And another up to $5,000 a year for electronic home-based services. So that's cool, kind of smart homes technology. Doors that automatically lock themselves, stoves that will shut themselves off. If the person with a disability is going to be alone for any point of the day, it can be like remote monitoring and remote supports too. By comparison, the CCC Plus waiver offers a one-to-one caregiver up to 56 hours a week. If the person needs nursing care, it can pay for a nurse. It still offers that 480 hours a year of respite and up to $5,000 a year to change the home or car or for portable technology, not for smart homes, not residential, not employment services, not a bunch of the others. But again, some great core services, which are often the most critical services for kiddos before they exit the school system when we've got a lot of supports already from family or the schools. So now we'll talk a little bit about how you would apply for these waivers. In Virginia, all of the waivers receive applications through local government organizations called community services boards. There are 40 community services boards throughout Virginia. And in Northern Virginia, it's all things like the Fairfax Community Services Board covers Fairfax, the Arlington Community Services Board covers Arlington, etc. But in more rural parts of this state, there could be a single community services board that covers multiple counties. So if you have any trouble locating yours, certainly let me know. But the Community Services Board and then the name of your county, if you just do an internet search for those, it should come up right away. And the process to go ahead and get things moving for that developmental disability waiver would be to call and get screened right there on the phone. Do you have a developmental disability or calling about someone who does? Yes. Great. We'll send out an application to you. Super. You'll fill out that application. They'll ask for the person's diagnosis and some basic information about them. I'll say, this looks good. Now let's meet and make sure the person is eligible. And they'll sit down and do an assessment called the VIDES. It's posted on the ARC of Northern Virginia's website in our resource library in the waiver section if you want to review it. But it really is an assessment for kids 0 to 3, or there's a different version for third birthday to day before you're 18, or a different version for adults, where we're looking at, compared to typically developing peers, are you needing notably more help with things like Learning new skills, managing safety, getting things done, managing your health, those kinds of things are the sorts of questions they'll ask. I think it's a great idea to look at that assessment ahead of time so you know exactly what they're going to want to ask about. For the CCC plus waiver, that waiver that requires a medical diagnosis and some kind of disability diagnosis but has no waiting list, then you're calling your local Department of Social Services. And again, the Northern Virginia numbers are listed here, but if you're elsewhere, your Department of Social Services may cover a couple of counties, and you can look them up. And there they'll do a more significant phone screening. On the phone, they'll ask lots of questions about bathing, dressing, and using the restroom in particular, in addition to medical needs. In my experience, this is the waiver children have more often than not because there's no waiting list, right? So as a young child, you're able to get it without having to wait necessarily. It does require a medical need. And as all of us as parents can say, the needs of a brand new baby without a disability and the needs of a brand new baby with a disability look similar for a while, right? All babies sleep at wackadoodle hours. All babies need total hands-on care to bathe, dress, eat, take care of everything. But as those kiddos start to develop a little bit more, we may see some more ability gaps. So by the first birthday, it's usually an easier time to get this service if you're calling about a child with a disability, and especially so by the second birthday, because by then we're seeing more gaps, right? Because 1 and 2-year-olds who are typically developing are starting to take part in helping to bathe themselves, right? They can stay still or they can help run a washcloth around. Even if they're not really effective, they can try. They can feed themselves. They can put food in their mouth or hold a cup. They can participate in helping to get themselves dressed, even if it's just putting their arm through the sleeve. So if you've got a kiddo who's not doing those kinds of things, who really is still having significant hands-on care needs, it's a great time after, like I said, first or second birthday, kind of depending upon the needs, to make sure that you're applying for this waiver, because you could get some services right away. After they do that phone screening, they'll send out a nurse to meet with you in person who will ask about really like the same kinds of things that y'all talked about uh, on the phone: bathing, dressing, using the restroom, that kind of hands-on care stuff, and medical needs. So it's a great time to, if you don't have it all kind of in your head, to have a list of all the doctors and specialists and diagnosis and medications and therapies and everything that are going on in this person's life. As parents, sometimes we don't even think about all those things that we manage and navigate and do, but we don't want to leave anything off the assessment. And I will say, if you think, my child has some medical needs, I think this waiver may be a good fit for them, and you call and you are denied, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to talk to you about why that is. But if you really feel like they're eligible, sometimes giving it another 6 months or so, again, so we're seeing kind of some of that ability gap between same age children with and without disabilities, that can help. Really focusing heavily on medical care. It's not a disability diagnosis. It's not an autism diagnosis that makes someone eligible for this waiver. It's that diagnosis plus medical needs. They have autism plus epilepsy, and I'm talking about the supports related to epilepsy that really matter. So that kind of mind shift can help us there. And then after they've deemed that you're eligible, right away, you'll start to begin talking about services, selecting caregivers like Apex Social, who could work through this program, or others. And again, there's no waiting list. Okay, so now let's talk about how you would use a waiver like this to help pay the cost for Apex caregivers. So for every single person in Virginia who has a Medicaid waiver, either the DD waiver or the CCC plus waiver, you sit down every year to write an annual plan, not wildly dissimilar from an IEP, really, in that it is an assessment of the person, a statement of their needs, a plan for services, and some goals for the year. Very IEP-ish, if you will. Each of those plans will have a set number of care hours that you're requesting each week. So years ago, when I was a case manager, I'd sit down with the family and say, okay, what hours is kiddo usually at school? Okay, when are they usually at home? What other sorts of activities and things do we always have planned, and who takes them to those? So we may find, some days they stay after school for a program, or some days they take the bus straight to therapies. So we didn't need a caregiver or caregiver hours for those days, but we looked at the hours when they were going to be home, like before or after school, or if they were not yet school age, just being at home, and then hours on evenings and weekends. right? So we would add all of those up, and then we would write a justification for why we needed care hours then, right? This is when we need support. This is the kind of support we need. And then it would come back with an approval. So let's say we would request 10 or 15 or 30 hours of care a week. Then Medicaid would say, okay, we'll pay for that 10 or 15 or 30 hours of care a week. And then the family can then say, okay, I know exactly who I want to hire to provide that care. I actually am already working with them, right? That's called consumer directed, meaning the person using the waiver is choosing their caregiver. Consumer directed care. And so then Medicaid will have that caregiver fill out things like a background check form, fingerprint forms, new hire paperwork, a lot of the same paperwork you would fill out when getting hired with Apex or any other job in the beginning, right? And then the parent becomes the employer of record. So they fill out their own paperwork and they say, I'm going to be the employer. I'm going to make sure that I sign off on timesheets, that the caregiver downloads the app to log into their timesheets, and I log in to check off that that's when they worked and those kinds of things. So you're sort of getting set up in this employer-employee relationship through Medicaid. And then for every hour that that caregiver works, they put it on the app in their timesheet, and then the parent goes in and says, yep, they worked all those hours this week. I'm going to electronically sign up on this timesheet, and the waiver will pay for all of those hours of care. I was going to note here, what does that waiver pay? Great question. There are two rates in Virginia. In Northern Virginia, and that's the little kind of bump out area that you can see on the map. So Arlington, Alexandria, Fairfax, which includes Falls Church, Loudoun, and Prince William County pay $16.45 an hour for that care. In other parts of the state, it's $12.70 an hour. If the caregiver is a live-in caregiver, like with Apex, then there's no federal income taxes. The person doesn't get paid time and a half for overtime, but for example, if the child with a disability is authorized for 50 hours of care a week, you could have one person bill for all 50 of those hours. The waiver can only pay that rate for the amount of hours that the person's worked. The person, the caregiver, can work any hours outside of that at a different rate. So what could that look like? Let's say, for example, our waiver user has 20 hours of care a week. So let's say their caregiver through Apex bills Medicaid for 20 hours of care that week at the rate of $16.45 an hour. Any hours outside of those 20 hours that were not already paid for by Medicaid, the family can pay Apex for directly at a different agreed upon rate. Medicaid can't choose what rates you set with people. So when you look at weekly or monthly fees to have the great team that you have with Apex working at you, you can sort of use this waiver money to deduct some of that, right? In this way, the caregiver is getting paid some way directly through Medicaid, and you are paying the rest of the fees for the other hours that they're working. And that can be a really creative way to do things and to reduce costs for caregivers, which we know are significant, and also leverage some important benefits for your child with a disability. I hope that kind of makes sense, but you're essentially using your waiver hours to offset some of the cost that's incurred by having somebody else. I'm happy to take questions if there are some. Like I mentioned, our website is thearcofnova.org. Right at the top of the page, and you can see that page kind of brought up here on the iPad. The first link, even though it's hard to see, says information and referral. You can ask us questions anytime, and we're happy to help. The next link is a provider directory. So if you needed someone like a tax accountant with disability expertise, we've gotten that question a lot this time of year. If you need an OT, those kinds of things. And then the third link over says resource library. And if you click on that, it brings up an alphabetical menu of topics. And so you can select waivers, and there'll be like a one-page quick waiver guide and examples of the waiver assessments to determine if people are eligible, tips on filling out waiver applications, those kinds of things. We have a very active Facebook page, facebook.com/thearcofnova is the page and how you would get to it, but lots of places where we share both our events, partner events, disability-related news. We have a not super active Twitter handle. We have a fairly active LinkedIn page and hundreds of videos on our YouTube channel that are recorded presentations similar to this or on other topics. We have a really large video series that we call 3-minute webinars. And so there's a 3-minute version of what's a waiver, and a 3-minute version of how do I use my waiver to pay for caregivers, and a 3-minute version of all kinds of topics, special education, basic safety things, all those sorts of things. And then there are lots of 1-hour extended versions where we dive into those topics in a lot more depth. But we know sometimes 3 minutes as parents on our phone is all we have. So we're happy to make that available. And as you're sharing information with other family members, siblings, school social workers, all kinds of other folks on your team, sometimes that 3-minute version is a little bit more digestible to them, and it helps them wrap their brain around all that you're trying to navigate. I'll stop sharing my screen here. And then Katerina, do you want to help me navigate questions here? What can I do that's helpful? And Katerina, you're still muted, which is a problem I'm familiar with.
Am I still muted?
No, I can hear you perfectly.
Okay. Sorry about that. Yes. But you're still muted now for me.
Huh. And so on my screen, it says something.
Okay, I got it. No.
Now
Is
can
it
you
working
hear me?
now?
Is it a funny thing? So it looks like I'm unmuted to me. I wonder if
Let
only
me
one of us
try.
can be.
I'm so sorry. Oh, so I'm the only one that can't hear. Okay, cool.
Okay. Are you a good lip reader? Okay, so all right, Angela and Megan, I can see that you can hear us, so we'll navigate from there. So I love that Sarah put in the chat there the reminder that Apex care professionals can work up to 45 hours a week or 10 hours per day. And so that's a great kind of bit of knowledge. So you'll funnel in through, maybe you get 10 or 15 hours of care through the waiver a week, and you apply that toward the Apex caregivers worker. What are timelines for applying for reimbursements is a great question. So you can submit timesheets up to a year from after the person provided services, assuming that at that time, what month is it? So embarrassing. April. So let's say we went back to like May of last year, right? So like 11 months ago. If in May of last year, the person with the disability was enrolled with a waiver, their parent was enrolled as the employer, the Apex professional was enrolled as their caregiver, but for some reason, we just never submitted a timesheet for then, right? Like maybe we forgot to do it, or maybe there was a glitch with it that we never went back and did, or whatever that is. Or maybe we submitted it and there was an error and we need to go back and fix it. So for any of those kinds of reasons, so long as like obviously the person was enrolled, the authorization was there, the hours were worked, you can go back and bill up to 365 days later. To state the obvious, that's not ideal. People should get paid right when they work. And if there is an issue when you submit that back billing, now you don't have any time to correct it if it gets kicked back again. So that's something to think about. But generally speaking, to kind of meet the pay period, at the end of every week, the parent caregiver would log into the app that they have through the waiver, and they would sign off on the timesheet. And then they'd get a note saying like, hey, if you don't sign off by today, Thursday, next Friday's pay period is going to be docked, right? Like we don't have the week that we need to process all of that time. And so that's all in the app, and it works on 2-week pay periods, like most places do. So I think it's Wednesday or Thursday, you've got to sign off on timesheets. If the following Friday, the equivalent of a week and a half later, you'd want the check to be as it should. So that's certainly something to make sure that you're on top of.
Okay. Can you hear me now, Lucy?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. We do have another question. So what about, do you have any insight on filing taxes when using the Medicaid waiver for families and care professionals?
Yes. And so for the family part, it's generally pretty easy because Medicaid waiver is paying the caregiver directly. No money is touched by the family, right? The family's job is to do the paperwork and fill out that timesheet. So there are no tax implications for the family for using a Medicaid waiver. There's no benefit or loss, I'll say. So that should be no big deal whatsoever. Because Apex caregivers are living in the home, like I said, they're not subject to most income taxes, which is great. So then they don't have to file that as tax money. But if for whatever reason, I don't think it's even possible, but if they were living outside the home and maybe providing hours of care on the side to another household, for example, let's say I live with John and mostly I support John, but on the weekends I go over and support Sally to make extra money on the side. Then when I go to support Sally on the weekends, because I don't live with her, that money would be taxed. And when you enroll with the Medicaid waiver program and you set up your timesheets and all that initially, just like you would usually fill out tax paperwork, you'll say, like this is how much tax I want withheld and those kinds of things. Oh, I see a question about if a family is eligible for CCC plus waiver, is coverage pretty immediate? This is such a Lucy answer. Well, kind of depends on your definition of immediate. So bureaucratic immediate insofar as if you called today, you could be and talk and got someone on the phone, which is possible. They could say, yeah, sounds like you're eligible. What's the first date a nurse could come out and meet with you to ask these same questions in person? And then the nurse would come out and do that. And they'd say, sounds like you're eligible. Let's get the paperwork process. So if the family was like every bit on top of filling out that paperwork, getting everything done and in that needed to be done, I would say 2 months is about the fastest I've ever seen it go. It's not unusual for it to take like 3 to 4 months on average, especially if it's things like, oh, I turned that paperwork in, but I'm not sure I followed up to make sure that they got it processed. Or there was I sent all the paperwork in, but something didn't come through in the scan, right? If you're not super on top of all those things, it can really delay it. So that's something to really be thinking about and applying sooner rather than later. It's a Medicaid program, so there's an annual renewal process, right? Like you'll meet each year to renew your hours and renew your care plan. But anytime during that time, right, you can be adding and using and layering in services or adjusting services too.
Okay, next question we have is, what are, if there's any, stipulations for duties or responsibilities that care professionals are allowed to do when using that waiver? Are there certain services they can or cannot provide?
Yeah, and for the waiver service that we're mostly talking about, where waivers paying that $16.45 an hour for that one-to-one caregiver, even if you had expertise or specialty as a nurse or a therapist or something else, you are not allowed to provide those services. Your job then will be what's reflected in the care plan, which really is like lots of hands-on help to the person. Bathing, dressing, making meals, getting things cleaned up, playing, going out in the community and navigating things, but really like not providing medical care or anything that's obviously like unsafe or neglectful.
Okay, does anybody else have any other questions?
Okay.
Thank you so much, Lucy, for taking the time and educating us. I know I definitely learned a lot that I did not know before. So it's very interesting. And
it's my pleasure. Yeah.
And I know it's something that may be happening in every state. So it's really interesting to learn how it works in each different state and how it's different in each state. And that's really interesting.
So hugely important to know for Apex folks all over the place. There's waivers everywhere. Sometimes usually they call it waiver, sometimes not. Sometimes they call it a disability waiver, sometimes not. But you can ferret out your equivalent, right? And some states do more comprehensive and interesting things than Virginia. But please, anybody's welcome to reach out anytime, either as a member of the Apex team helping a family or families directly, and we're happy to help. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.